Om Asatoma Satkamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Aviravirmayethi Rudrayatte Dakshinam Mukham Tenamam Pahi Nityam. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine Consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. So, rejoice, rejoice, he was born on this day. As we are aware, it wasn't this day. Actually, according to the lunar calendar, this year it comes a little bit later, on 23rd of this month. The day Buddha was born is also known as the thrice blessed day, because the day he was born and the day he attained enlightenment and the day that he passed away all happened to be same day on the calendar, of the lunar calendar. And so it's called the thrice blessed day. And in some strange sort of coincidence, today is a thrice blessed day too. Well, it's a Mother's Day, so salutations to all the mothers of the past, present, and future. Today is actually, according to the lunar calendar, a birthday of Shankaracharya. And of course, we are going to, this morning, reflect a little bit on the life and teachings of the Buddha. So, it's a thrice blessed day also because all these three, the ideal of motherhood, the ideal that Shankaracharya stood for, and the ideal that the Buddha stood for, all of them we find in all of those three ideals, the ideals in Vedanta themselves. And so it's a happy coincidence that we are celebrating a thrice blessed day in our own way. One of the fascinating, among the very interesting incidents in Buddha's life, there is this one incident, which the first time I read it, I remember how thrilled I was, and every time I remember it, it just feels wonderful. And it is this, that after enlightenment, the Buddha was once sitting by the roadside under a tree, and he just sitting there quietly, peacefully. And he was in a different town, no one knew him there, and all the passers-by wondered, who is this person? A newcomer, a stranger. And so whenever they passed by and he saw them and they saw him, some asked him, who are you? Are you a hermit? And Buddha would simply just sit there and maybe just shake his head. Then he said, who are you? Are you a beggar? Are you a saint? Are you a sage? They tried all the different categories they were aware of. And Buddha simply in the end said, I am awake. That was the only way he described himself. And the Buddha, it was not really the name that anybody gave him. Buddha in Sanskrit means one who is awake. And so towards the end of his life, as the end was, he lived for he had a very long life. And so when the end was near, his immediate disciples gathered around him. And of course, naturally, as one may expect, they were all grieving that our beloved teacher will be leaving us soon. And that time, you could almost say it was his final teaching. He told his disciples, Buddha is not a person. Buddha is a state. Enter all of you. In other words, every one of us is a potential Buddha. We may be awake now, but in a spiritual sense, we are still sleeping. And if being awake, think about what we say awake in our daily life as well. When we wake up, why do we call that waking up? Because whatever we experienced in sleep Either we were fast asleep, not seeing anything, or we were dreaming. But the reality, the so-called reality we saw in the dream, was not the real reality. When we wake up in the morning and find it, now I'm back into the real world. And so encountering reality is what we say waking up. And what Vedanta teaches us is, what we are experiencing now, all this diversity, multiplicity, and the chaos inside and outside, that's not the reality. So from that larger perspective, we are still dreaming. In Sanskrit, they define dream as ayathartha darshanam, not seeing things correctly. And if it is true that God alone exists, if it is true that God is omnipresent, that the divine is present everywhere and in everyone, the question that we can ask is, am I really seeing the divine in me or before me and in the hearts of everyone around me? And we say, no. So I'm not seeing what is there, and I'm seeing what is not there. And so from that standpoint, we're still dreaming. We haven't woken up yet. And so we have not become Buddhas yet. And so that's the idea. So what we will do now in the next few minutes, just take a look at some of the incidents from Buddha's life, and not just from a historical standpoint, but when we look at some of these incidents from his life, some of the key teachings that came to us through him, but we also find reflected in the Upanishads and Vedanta, we find all of them through the different incidents in his life. The story of his birth is also well known. We have had a chance to reflect on it many times. Many of you have already read and heard and seen a lot of it yourself. With nowadays, with so many videos and YouTubes and all of that, none of this is a big mystery. He was born on a full moon night, and an interesting thing was, it was as was customary then, and probably to a large extent even today in the Eastern countries. As soon as a child is born, they prepare a horoscope, seeing the time of his birth, the position of all the planets and the stars. A horoscope is made, which oftentimes gives some idea, or is believed to give some idea about the future of this newborn baby. So when this young prince, his father was a king, so this prince was born, they drew up a horoscope. And then they came with the results, and they reported to the king, this baby, this heir to the throne that is born, there are two possibilities. Either he will become an extraordinary king and emperor, or he will develop such great renunciation and vairagya and detachment, he will leave all this royal household and go and become a monk and do extraordinary things in spiritual life. And he was the only heir to the throne, and of course his father didn't want him to go anywhere. And so we read that being a king, he could do what would probably be impossible for most of us. So he made arrangement that this son of his, who was the growing baby, growing child, will never ever encounter any kind of misery or sorrow anywhere. The idea was, if he encounters some painful things, then some kind of a detachment might come and he might go away. So he said, I'm going to just surround him with everything positive, everything joyful. All the employees in that palace were told him, some days, if you are feeling miserable, don't report on duty. We want only cheerful, smiling people around the growing prince. And it worked. As I said, because he was a king, he could do all these things. And we know it's how difficult it is to do it in our own families, something like this. So, but up to a point it worked. But when this Siddhartha, his name was, he was given the name Siddhartha. So as he was growing up, when he became a teenager, and then obviously, you couldn't keep him confined within the palace for long. And so one day he asked his charioteer, I would like to take me around a ride around the city. And so we read that his charioteer and the prince sat in the chariot. He took him for a round in the city. And this was the first time he was coming out of the palace. And he was very curious. What's what? What's going on? And he saw wonderful sights. But then one thing he saw, and he just couldn't make sense of it. And that was, he saw a person who was kind of coughing and sneezing and showing signs of distress. And he had never seen what illness or disease meant, because people around him were told not to have any of those sights available to him. So he asked the charioteer, what's wrong with that person? And the charioteer then, who was an elderly person, said, young prince, that's called illness. That person is sick and would need treatment. And then this young prince said, Siddhartha said, that's something I didn't know. Then they go further. After some distance, he saw a man walking by the side of the road. His whole frame was bent. He was holding a stick and was moving slowly. And then this prince, Siddhartha, asked the charioteer, why is this man and why does he need a stick? And then the charioteer told the prince, young prince, that's called old age. When people become aged, then their physical vigor reduces and they need support. They are not able to balance sometimes, so he's carrying the stick for support. As he was seeing these sights, the young prince was becoming more and more thoughtful. And then he goes some distance further, and then he saw a man was sleeping, and then 4 other people were carrying him, that sleeping man, on their shoulders. And the prince said, why is that man sleeping and why are they carrying him? And then the charioteer said, young prince, that person is not sleeping, that person is dead. And so when people are dead, they are carried to the cremation ground and then the body is cremated. The prince became even more thoughtful. And then in some versions of the story, we see that later on he found another one person wearing some kind of ragged robes, but just walking peacefully by the side of the road. And just kind of the peace and harmony that person was exuding. So the prince asked the charioteer, who is that person? He seems to carry so much peace and joy in his heart. And then the charioteer said, that's a monk. And he has given up everything and is going in search of the divine. And after the prince had seen enough, he told the charioteer, okay, now let's go back home. So they came back to the palace, and this prince was thinking. And the story goes on to say that at that very night, he decided, I'm just going to leave everything and go. And people have often thought about, among the hundreds of different things and new things that he saw when he went outside, why these 3 sights made such a profound impression on him. And clearly, this is the sight of sickness, aging, death. And interestingly enough, in the Gita, we have this verse which Krishna says that the defects of embodied living, the defects of the life that all living beings have. And he says, Janma, Mrityu, Jara, Vyadhi. Exactly these 3 things. Jara is aging, Vyadhi is sickness, and Janma, Mrityu, the presence of death. And we can know that later on in Buddha's life, how the beginning of his teaching emphasizes the idea that life is suffering. And the reason, and it gives us a chance to reflect on what could Buddha have meant by saying life is suffering. Someone who, for the complete first 15, 16, 17 years of his life, had known no suffering and no personal suffering. Just these three sides that he saw. So how can he say that life is suffering when that was contrary to his own experience? And today we know contrary from our own experience. Yes, there is suffering in life, but none of us can say life is only suffering. We have joy and we have suffering as well. So do we need to take Buddha's teaching that life is suffering seriously when it doesn't match with our own experience? Or did he mean something more profound when he used the word suffering? Dukkha, that's the word he used. And one way of understanding that is that, at least in the way this story is narrated in Buddha's life, it's possible, and it doesn't seem impossible when they took this long chariot ride, that he may have seen some poor people on the way, he might have seen some hungry people on the way, clearly, and he may have asked questions to a charioteer about them as well. But why is it that only these three sides may completely transformed his way of thinking? And the reason is probably this, that we could divide suffering into at least two basic categories. One is the kind of suffering that we all have. It's not universal in the sense not everyone is having this. For instance, the sorrow and suffering associated with hunger. We know even right now, even at this very moment, in some troubled parts of the world, what's happening in Gaza, what's happening in Ukraine, the troubled parts of the world, there are people dying, not just through the bombs, and which is terrible enough, but because of lack of food, lack of any aid reaching there. So the sorrow and suffering associated with these real problems in our daily life cannot be ignored. So there is suffering, sorrow associated with hunger, with homelessness. We know all these, with exploitation, with abuse. These are all very real. But it's possible to distinguish those kinds of suffering from the suffering with aging, sickness, and death. And the reason we could separate them into two different categories is that the first kind of hunger and homelessness, while very real, is not necessarily universal, in the sense not every person is dying of hunger, not every person is homeless. But the second group of causes of suffering, no one is exempt, absolutely no one. Whether we are rich or poor, east or west, irrespective of any other distinctions, every living being, and not just human being, even animals, plants, every living entity will age with time. Every living entity will become dysfunctional. Things will not work the way they are supposed to function. That's what really illness or sickness is. And eventually, every living entity will one day die. So all the suffering associated with these is inseparable from the fact that we exist as living beings. In that sense, we can say this is an existential cause or existential suffering. And this young prince, we don't know how much he reasoned out at that age, but intuitively, he knew that there doesn't seem to be any way out of this. And one way would be to say, that's just the way things are. Make the most of what we have and don't worry about all these things. That's kind of seems to be a pragmatic way of thinking many of us might want to adopt. But we know that no matter how much we try to engage ourselves with things and try not to think about these things, we can never really not think about it. There will be several occasions in life when we have to deal with it. We have to confront it. And the Buddha, or Siddhartha then, he said, unless and until I find a way out of this, or to first of all find whether is there a way out of this suffering, I'm going to go and not do anything else. And so that night, the Buddha leaves the palace and goes out into the wilderness, so to speak, to find an answer to this question. Sometimes it is also said, again, this is just the way his biography has come down to us. Sometimes people trace that this quest of Siddhartha to go and search for truth may not have been only for just to satisfy his own curiosity or his own interest in the subject. That he wanted to find an answer which will not only benefit him personally, but for benefit all. And that's why he sacrificed his princely life, his young wife, his young child who was growing up, and then goes out to find an answer. And so people find in this traces of sacrificing one's own interest for a greater good. We read then that when he goes out and then he is able to find a few other hermits who were also trying to find an answer. And so it became a small community itself. There were a few of them and he joined them, and then they were known to practice extreme austerities. They won't eat for days and extremely, just kind of a self-mortification. And they spent a lot of time, and the description goes on to say the Buddha's body became so emaciated. His all rib cage could be seen. He was barely eating anything. But after a few months had passed that way, this prince, Siddhartha, we won't stop calling him prince now, he's already left the palace. So Siddhartha then decided, I don't think that simply torturing oneself this way will find an answer to the question. So he says, okay, I will no longer follow the kind of routine and tradition these people have. I'm going to go out into the nearby village, and I'm feeling extremely hungry. I'm going to eat some food and continue my search for the truth, but not with this extreme way of depriving oneself of the basic needs of life. And so he goes out, and then we say there is this young village girl, her name is Sujata, and then she brings him a bowl of milk, and the Buddha drinks that milk. And then in some books they describe these other hermits who were practicing with him first, and they saw that he has gone, and they start whispering among themselves, as sometimes people in communities do, that, oh, he has fallen from the path. He was for doing all the discipline with us. He could not bear the rigor of the practice, and he is a fallen yogi now. And of course, the Buddha didn't care. He was determined to find the truth, but not in this way, because he felt this wouldn't work. And so he followed what then later became known as the middle path. Neither extreme indulgence nor extreme deprivation. Neither of these two extremes will help in finding the truth, finding the answer. The answer is to have a balanced life, a life of harmony, being in the middle. And that's why the middle path, the Madhyam Pantha or Madhyam Pantha in Pali, as we read in the Buddhist texts. After following this middle path for a long time, Buddha felt a time had come now to kind of give the final push. And so we find him sitting under a huge tree, and that tree now is called the Bodhi tree. It's in a place called Gaya, a little away from Benares in northern India. So Buddha sat under the tree, and he made a firm resolve that now I'm going to sit under this tree, and I'm not going to get up until I find the answer. There is a Sanskrit life of the Buddha called Lalit Vistara, in which that resolve of Buddha is described in a very powerful language. It goes something like this. Ihasane shushyatu me shariram tvagasti mamsam pralayancha yatu aprapya bodhim bahukalpa durlabham naivasanat kayamataschalishyate. And to paraphrase it, what it really means is this seat, this meditation cushion or a rock or wherever he was sitting, may my body dry up if necessary on this place. May my bones, all the parts of my body, may they all be reduced to their elements. But I will not move from this seat until I attain that wisdom, that knowledge, that answer. The question that his chariot ride had risen in his mind, until I find an answer to that question, I will not move. So he sat under the tree at night, and then early morning, there's this full moon shining in the sky, he got an answer. He became enlightened. He finally found an answer to that question. And that answer then is found embedded in that fourfold teaching of the Buddha. So what he found was there is suffering in life, but he also discovered there is a way out of the suffering. It's not like a hopeless situation. There is suffering and you can't do anything about it. He found you can do something about it. But what is the cause of the suffering? And the cause of the suffering he found is tanha, which normally we translate as desire or hankering. And then the way out of the suffering would be if we can find a way to somehow transcend this always the feeling of incompleteness within us. Because only we seek what we lack. Why do I feel a sense of lacking? If I feel I don't lack anything, I won't want anything. So at the root of all desire is the sense of incompleteness in my heart. So Buddha wanted to find out how to become full, how not to feel unfulfilled. And then the answer he found of how to achieve that then became codified in later Buddhist way of thinking, that eightfold path. So he did find an answer. There is an interesting thing that happened. So once he became enlightened, now, as Holy Mother said, when a person becomes enlightened, when a person becomes realized, how do you know whether the person has become realized or not? And Holy Mother said, the person doesn't grow a pair of horns. I mean, if there's some external something happening, then you could say, oh, we see that, and then that person is enlightened. But apparently, externally, nothing changes. And so when Buddha found that answer, and he was so happy, his heart was filled with joy, filled with peace. And then he heard a voice which said, you have attained enlightenment. Who will believe you? You might go and tell everyone, oh, this is the answer. Who is going to believe you? Who is the witness? Who will guarantee that you have found the truth? And then Buddha, who was sitting on that seat, with one hand, both his hands were on his lap. So one hand, then he touched the ground and he said, the earth is my witness. So sometimes you'll find in some Buddhist images of Buddha or pictures of Buddha, sometimes you'll have both of his arms on his chest when he's sitting. And in some way, one hand will be on his lap and the other will be touching the ground. And that is sometimes referred to as the Bhumi Sparsha Mudra. Bhumi is the earth, the touching the earth. And that was the way of saying, it's not as if nobody knows. This Mother Earth is the witness of what I have seen. And then we read that he got up from that seat and started walking. And the beauty of someone who has touched that source of peace and joy within is that that person doesn't have to do anything or show how much peace I have got, how much joy I have got. They kind of exude that peace and joy. So every step that the Buddha took was just filled with joy, filled with peace. People could instinctively feel that. So that peaceful, harmonious way the Buddha was walking along. And it just so happened that he came near the place. Remember those 4 or 5 young hermits with whom he was practicing and who had thought he had fallen away? They were in that area. And so they saw from a distance, this fallen yogi now is coming. And they were talking among themselves. Oh, a few months ago, he left us and went. And now he's approaching us. And they said, we're not going to get up. We're not going to show him any respect. He doesn't deserve our respect. And so they are all planned and sitting there like that. And of course, the Buddha comes and he's just sitting there peacefully walking that way. As soon as the Buddha draws near, all these 4 or 5 hermits who had decided not to be respectful to him, they just can't stop themselves. They just get up and fall flat at his feet. And the Buddha, they become the Buddha's first disciples. So you see, and we see the power of purity, the power of knowledge, the power of enlightenment. In spite of these people's determination to not do so, they just could not stop themselves. The power of purity actually there's another one interesting incident mentioned in Buddha's life. And that is in the Vedic times, and clearly at the time of Buddha as well, one of the things that he was very critical about was that there was so much rituals had entered into religious practice. People and the worship in those days was worship done in fire. All the offerings made to fire to all these different deities up in some celestial spheres. And so much rituals was being done. And Buddha then, after his enlightenment, during his teachings, he came down heavily upon these rituals. And he said, no, stop all that, because the truth is in the heart. Now, sometimes when we read the teachings of these great ones, it's easy to learn them, but also easy to misunderstand them as well. Because sometimes when the Buddha said he looked down upon rituals, most people say, oh, that's useless. And even we kind of see that even today, 2,500 years later after Buddha, some people will just kind of not think highly about rituals. Somehow it's felt like meditation, knowledge, consciousness is something that's real spirituality. Well, these rituals, I don't think the Buddha would have agreed. So when these great ones condemn something, we have to see what exactly are they condemning. Because we know, even not just at the time of Buddha, but even later, so many people, so many great saints and mystics, and many of us in our own lives have found the benefit, the real benefit of doing ritualistic worship or prayer, all the different rituals that we have. So what Buddha was saying was not saying rituals in themselves are like bad or wrong or hurtful. But if the rituals are not accompanied by the inner spirit of those rituals, then they become mechanical. So what he was critical about was just the external show of religion unaccompanied by the inner spirit that must go with everything. So religiosity can be an external something or an external but accompanied by the internal. So for instance, just to give a very simple example, it's possible to go to a place of worship regularly, so maybe every week or even more often, and feel that, oh, I go to a temple, I go to a church, I go to a synagogue regularly, I'm a very religious person. Perhaps yes, but not necessarily. It's possible to kind of have these externalities of religion, do this, and yet there are people who go and do this regularly, and yet we find they maybe in their lives, they may not be following with all the implications of what their religious tradition teaches. It's possible there are people, and really in every tradition. But in India, when I was growing up, I saw people who would religiously go to a temple, do the arati, attend all the festivals, and then go at their workplace and then cheat and loot and bribe and do all kinds of unethical things without even recognizing the contradictions involved. And so that is what the Buddha was coming down against. And so what he said was that all these externalities in religion are helpful provided they come from inside out. It's not the point is not to show someone that we are religious, but that the spirit within should show. That is what the Buddha was emphasizing. And so one other teaching that flows from this is there is this story or imagery that often finds in many Buddhist traditions is about the finger pointing at the moon. That if a little child and you want to show, oh, look at that thing in the sky or the moon or whatever, so you point the finger, and if the child starts looking at the finger, not at the moon, they say, don't look at the finger, look at the moon. Concepts and ideas and rituals, all of these things are great help because they point to the reality, point to the truth. But if instead of looking at reality, I busy myself entirely with these concepts, then I'm missing the point. It's a little bit like you want to buy, say, let's see, if you maybe you want to buy some Alfonso mangoes. It's one variety of mangoes, and you don't know how those mangoes look. And so somebody gives you a picture of an Alfonso and says, this is how it looks. Now go into the market and see if these mangoes have come and get them. And then you spend the rest of your life, not life, rest of your time just kind of holding onto that piece of paper and say, oh, this is the picture, and make copies of it and distribute it among your friends. When are you going to actually go and get that mango? The picture is helpful because it may help you identify the real mango, but ultimately you need to go and at some point throw away that picture and get the real mango. So all of these ideas and concepts and the different theological structures that we have in different are helpful, are definitely helpful. But if I just keep on engaging with these things and forget the reality, then we are in trouble. So to give kind of one example, we know that in the Upanishads, there is so much talk about the Atman, the self. And it's helpful that a reality, but the true me, the real being, beyond the body, mind, and ego, and so on. But all of these are still concepts in our head, unless and until we actually experience the presence of the Atman within. But people, they've just kept on fighting and arguing and debating about what is the nature of the Atman. Is it this? Is it small? Is it big? What does it mean it is beyond this? Books were written, debates were made. And then Buddha was so disgusted with all these just people dealing with just concepts. And so it was a very radical teaching. And he said, stop thinking about it. There is no Atman. Idea was, stop dealing with concepts. Go to the heart of the matter. Go to the reality. If Atman exists, find it. Experience it yourself. But human beings are human beings. So they were told to break their connection with that idea of the Atman, the concept of the Atman. And so they said, the Buddha said, no Atman. So what did they do? They made no Atman a concept. So that's we came from Atma to Anatma. And then instead of busying themselves with this concept of the Atman, they started busying with themselves with the concept of the no Atman. In fact, in one of his discourse, Buddha says, and this is amazing, it's not often quoted, but you will find it in the books. Buddha said, those who are attached to the, he said, those who are attached to the concept of the Atman have some hope. But those who are attached to the concept of no Atman have no hope. He himself was disgusted that people had totally misunderstood what he wanted to say. And that's why all of these great teachers, their teachings are sometimes deceptively simple. When you read them, and it just makes sense. But then, just because it makes sense, it's not enough to then just say, okay, I've understood. It's good to look at that teaching, even if it makes sense, and allow it to revolve in our head a little bit. And then we begin to see the subtle nuances beneath it. So even when Buddha said there is no self, what did he mean by that? And there's another way that that teaching can be understood as well. For most of us, even when we read Vedanta texts and read the Gita, the Upanishads, and we say, there's so much talk of self in that one. And yes, we have the word Atman and so on. Yes, we hear it beyond the mind, beyond the ego and all of that. But our lived experience is that idea of the self, for most of us, the most we can go to is our ego. That's what gives us a sense of I. And so we may think Atman in the head, but we are really referring to the ego in the heart. And so that's what Buddha meant. There is no self in the sense, stop identifying yourself with that ego inside. Because the ego, as Sri Ramakrishna pointed out, is the main hurdle in what separates us from that ultimate truth, ultimate reality. That ego has to get out of the way. And so there are all of these nuances we find in Buddha's teachings. So there is this one final story. There are many stories, but I'll just limit myself. And there's one final story, and then we will stop. And that is a story we read in the Buddhist tradition. And it's kind of become the heart of what become known as the Lotus Sutra. It deals with the lotus. And the story that is told about this is that in whichever, Buddha often traveled from place to place. By the time the Buddhism, let me say something about Buddhism itself. And that is, just last week, we had several students of the middle school of Hilltop Montessori School from Vermont. They were visiting the city. They were here for about 6 days. And they came to the Vedanta Center, spent about an hour and a half here. And I was speaking with them in our sitting room outside, and then I came and showed him this place, and they just loved it. What was fascinating was they were surprised to find the Buddha right there. You know, he's the Buddha. If you haven't seen it afterwards, you can go out and see. We have a Buddha there. And so all these little kids were adorable. They were wonderful. And so they said, what is the Buddha doing here? Because they were told in their itinerary, they had already been to a Buddhist monastery, and now they're coming to a Vedanta place, and they found a Buddha here as well. And so I told them, Buddha was not a Buddhist. And the idea, clearly, as you can understand, all of these great ones, they were reformers, seen as reformers within and by their contemporaries. Clearly, there were things that needed improvement, things that needed to be changed, things that needed to be reformed in his time. And so Buddha was a Hindu reformer. It's only long after Buddha's passing that his teaching kind of took on the community that started after him kind of became a cohesive force. And at some point they felt we have a different identity than these other larger communities of which they were a part. So it takes a while for the sense that this is a different religion that has come out of it. Nowhere in Buddha's teachings, there is not even a hint that he ever says, oh, this is something, I'm starting a new religion. I'm a founder of a new religion. It was a reforming of the tradition, and that's pretty much all the great reformers who come to do. They are not looking for like starting a company of my own, like starting a religion of my own. That's not the point. They are there to, first of all, find answers to questions themselves and then help those who are around them. And so That's what I meant when I say, but in the Buddhist circle, clearly now, Buddha is a central figure in the Buddhist tradition. So there is this story. So when he was going from, oftentimes he would travel from one monastery to another. During his time, India was filled, the Indian subcontinent was filled with monasteries, thousands and thousands of monks. In fact, when the tradition, as it grew in its initial form, it tended to be mostly a monastic tradition. It took a while for it to kind of take on a larger color of its own. So that monastery where the Buddha was staying at that time, there was we read in his life, there was 1,200 monks and nuns who would attend his teaching. And so every morning he would come, he would give some teaching, and then they would meditate, and then they would go and do whatever their other responsibilities in the day. So one morning, when it was time for the Buddha's talk, all of these 1,200 monks and nuns are sitting in front of him. The Buddha comes and sits, and then everyone's waiting for him to say something. And just think about it this way. Now, many of you have gotten used to it. When we have a satsang, I do a prayer, and then we have a song, and then I come and then I speak. Now, suppose one day I would just come and just sit and just not say anything at all. Of course, you would begin to wonder, like, what happened? Why is he not speaking, right? So this is what happened. The Buddha, he came for that one morning, and everyone's waiting for him to start, and Buddha doesn't say anything, just there. And then everyone's like, why? What happened? Why is he not speaking? And then Buddha, he just brought with him one lotus, a red lotus. And then he just held that lotus. No expression on the face, just held the lotus like this. All of these monks, they are all thinking, what happened? Why is he not speaking? And why is he holding a lotus? And why is it a red lotus? And why not? Why only one? Why not two? All these thoughts are going on in their minds. Only one among those 1,200 people, he smiled. He just looked what they did, and this one among them, his name is said to be Anathapindika, one of the monks, he just looked and he smiled. And seeing him smile, the Buddha smiled. And then he gets up and he leaves and goes. That's all. Not a word was spoken. And now books and commentaries have been written about what exactly was he teaching? And what was it that one monk who smiled, what did he understand? So what was the insight that the Buddha gave? And so that's essentially the story. And I wouldn't bother you with all the commentaries and everything, because I haven't read them myself. But what makes sense to me, among the explanations that I have read about this, is actually a pretty common sense explanation. And that is this. Buddha holds up a lotus in his hand. What would he want the people to do? Well, if you hold something in hand, you expect the people to see it, right? Nobody was seeing it. They were asking questions to themselves. Why one lotus? Why red? So they were really seeing the thoughts in their own mind, the questions in their own mind. There's only this one person among those 1,200 who was not thinking anything. Because Buddha did not say, now analyze this or think about it. He just held it, see it. So if we are able to see something without the filter of the mind, it's the mind that raises questions. It's the mind that provides possibilities. It's the mind that deals with concepts. If I can see something without this filter of the mind and the senses, I will see things as they exactly are. And so that one monk, he saw the reality of the lotus as it is. And Buddha saw that he saw. And so that's the joy of seeing that reality made that monk smile. And seeing that this one monk had caught it, Buddha was happy and he smiled. A profound teaching in itself. No word is spoken. And we have to then ask ourselves, as we go through our day-to-day activities, are we really seeing anything at all? Or are we just seeing the reactions in our head? You see a person, you meet a person, you go to a place, you eat your food, and everything like, oh, this is tasty. This is exactly as I ate when I went to Florence. No, but if I just put my whole mind on the food will taste different if I'm just be present. If we meet a person, if a person in front, we always have some pre-existing ideas about who this person is and how this person is and what this person is going to say. We're not seeing the person at all. But if we can get all of that out of the way, chances are we will see the reality as it is. And that is the Vedantic teaching. That, in fact, and to kind of put it even more bluntly, now, if my eyes are closed, I don't see anything. When I open my eyes, for the first teeniest of fraction, I'm seeing reality as it is. But that reality gets covered by all the ideas I have. So as soon as I see, oh, this is a person, this is a man, this is a woman, this is morning, this is summer, this is month of May, all these ideas hide, I'm not able to see anything. But if somehow I can get rid of all these ideas, I will see that in front of me is God Himself, is the reality itself. So we go in search of truth, we go in search of reality. It is not hiding anywhere. It's right here before our eyes. But we refuse to see it. We just see what's going on in our heads. And that has to stop. So Buddha's teachings are very profound. They go beyond. It's not helpful to just think about, oh, that is the Buddhism, that is Buddhist teaching. If you go to the heart of the matter, it transcends all these religious categories. It goes to the very heart of the matter. And that's why Swami Vivekananda referred to the Buddha as the greatest teacher of Vedanta ever born. And so his birthday, as I said, falls on the 23rd of this month. But when you get an opportunity or a time or a leisure, I would encourage you to reflect. It's a profoundly inspiring life. And there is so much we can learn and transform ourselves. So on this day, we already had this song, Rejoice on this day. And that's really a cause to rejoice. If even a little bit of the insights that the Buddha offered are able to illumine our hearts and bring that at least some measure of peace and harmony and joy and truth in our own lives. Om Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhur Muhu.